Hey there, welcome back. Tonight we're taking a quiet journey into something most history books tend to gloss over, the gentle, hazy art of getting drunk in ancient Egypt. Not the wars or the monuments, not the pharaohs or their gold, but the warm, buzzing hum of ordinary evenings, when people laughed a little too loudly, when cups were refilled too quickly, and when even the gods were said to enjoy a good drink. So let's slow down, breathe a little, and take a closer look at what life was really like along the Nile. When the air smelled of wet barley and honey, and the moon hung low over 1,000 clay jars. All you have to do is settle in, get comfortable, and let the story drift over you, like the slow ripples of a river that has seen it all. Before we start, a small favor. If you enjoy these calm journeys into the forgotten corners of the past, consider liking the video or subscribing. Only if you really enjoy it. And while you're here, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I love imagining this invisible web of listeners scattered across the world, drifting off to the same story under different skies. Now, let's step softly back in time. Picture the Nile at dusk. The water gleams bronze under the fading sun, and the air carries that heavy sweetness that comes just before night. The fields are quiet now. The oxen are tied, the shadoof buckets hang still, and somewhere nearby, a faint smell of baking bread drifts through the air. But it isn't just bread they're making, it's beer, or what the Egyptians called heket, or tenemu, the lifeblood of their days and nights. You might be imagining something like a modern pint, golden and bubbly, maybe a bit cold. No. Egyptian beer was closer to a liquid meal, thick, porridge-like, rich with yeast and grain, the color of desert clay. It wasn't served in glass, but ladled from large jars into smaller bowls or cups, often shared from hand to hand. It was warm, dense, and filling, and it got you delightfully, softly drunk. Beer wasn't just for celebrations, it was a part of everyday life. Workers who built the pyramids were paid partly in beer, gallons of it every week. There is a famous line from a worker's record at Giza. One must drink beer every day, to live and to work. And they meant it. Beer nourished as much as it intoxicated. It was food and water and pleasure all in one. Imagine a small village on the Nile's edge. The evening is young. The workday has ended. Families gather outside mud brick houses. Children chase goats through the dust. And in the center, women stir pots over small fires. Nearby, a few men are pouring beer from tall clay jars into wide, rounded cups, passing them around laughing, slapping each other on the shoulder. You can almost hear the hum of conversation. The smell of yeast, grain, and smoke hangs in the air, blending with the faint perfume of lotus flowers drifting downriver. Someone starts to sing, a lazy, off-key tune about love or luck, and for a moment, life feels eternal. But beer in Egypt wasn't just a drink, it was sacred. It was tied to creation itself, to the story of the gods and their moods. They said that beer was the gift of Hathor, goddess of joy, love, and intoxication. And once it had even saved humanity. The tale goes that the fierce lion-headed goddess Sekhmet, enraged by humanity's disobedience, went on a rampage. Her wrath was unstoppable, the Nile ran red, the fields burned, and the gods feared she would destroy every living soul. So Ra, the sun god, had an idea. He ordered thousands of jars of beer to be dyed red with ochre and poured across the fields. When Sekhmet came upon the blood, she drank deeply and drank again and again until she grew dizzy and fell asleep, her rage soothed by intoxication. When she awoke, the slaughter was over and humanity was saved. From then on, every year the Egyptians celebrated the festival of drunkenness in her honor, a night of wild music, dancing, and endless cups of beer. Imagine that for a moment. An entire city swaying together under the torchlight, laughter echoing off temple walls, priests blessing the crowd while everyone drinks themselves into divine joy. Of course, not all drunkenness was divine. Sometimes it was just human. There are ancient letters and poems, fragments from scribes, complaining about those who drink too much and talk nonsense. There were even little moral lessons written on papyrus. Do not spend your days drinking beer. You will forget your duty and bring shame upon yourself. And yet, they drank. Because the Nile's rhythm was steady but hard, and life was short and full of sun and dust. And sometimes a man or woman just needed to forget for a while, to laugh louder than the day allowed. Let's step inside a small tavern, not the polished marble of a temple court, but a narrow room shaded by palm leaves, with packed earth beneath your feet. Low benches line the walls. There are jars of beer stacked in a corner, sealed with clay and straw. The air is warm, thick with the scent of fermented grain. A woman pours you a cup. Her hands are steady. She's seen hundreds like you come and go, farmers, sailors, scribes. Someone at the back starts telling a story, exaggerated, hilarious, about a crocodile that chased him across the marsh. Everyone laughs. Someone spills a drink. No one minds. And when the night deepens and the lanterns burn low, someone begins to hum an old hymn, maybe to Hathor, maybe just to the quiet of the stars. You sip, and the taste is strange, sour and earthy, heavy with barley. It warms you from the inside, and suddenly the world feels softer, slower, kinder. You look around and think, perhaps this too is civilization. The art of coming together, of forgetting yourself for a little while. Out on the river, the moon climbs higher. Boats drift silently by, the sound of their oars barely breaking the stillness. Somewhere in the dark, a jackal calls. The night smells of grain, honey, and smoke, and laughter echoes faintly, carried by the desert wind. If you were to look closely, you might see a group of young men walking home, arms slung around each other, singing to the stars. Their sandals drag, their speech slurs, but their hearts are light. In the distance, a priest locks the temple gate, muttering something about excess. But even he smiles, just a little, because even in a land that worshipped order, that measured the stars and the floods and the calendar of eternity, there was room for chaos, for the gentle golden blur of drunken joy. The ancient Egyptians didn't just drink to forget. They drank to remember the gods, the harvest, the bonds between friends, to feel alive, to feel divine. And maybe as the embers fade and the jars grow empty, you can still hear their voices, carried across time like the low murmur of the Nile itself. Let's imagine the beginning. Not the clinking of cups or the laughter of taverns, but something simpler. A field, the Nile swelling after the flood, soaking the dark earth. Men and women bent over rows of barley, their feet sinking slightly into the mud, their hands scattering seed in the same rhythm their grandparents once sang in. Because this, long before the temples and the gods, was where intoxication was born. In the hum of labor, in the warmth of the sun, and in the quiet accident of fermentation. Picture it, a basket of barley bread left out in the heat, soaked by water from the river. Days pass. The smell changes. Sour, strange, but not unpleasant. Someone, curious or hungry, tastes it, and in that moment, something ancient stirs. A sweetness, a warmth. Their body grows lighter, laughter comes more easily, and the world, so often harsh and sharp-edged, softens around the corners. It's hard to say whether they understood what had happened, but from that moment onward, they chased it. Beer, in Egypt, wasn't a drink that came from theory or invention. It came from experience, from repetition, from habit, from 1,000 small mistakes that became a craft. Barley was the heart of it. The Egyptians grew 2 main grains, barley and emmer wheat. Both were hardy, both could survive the unpredictable moods of the Nile. Barley, though, had a secret talent. It fermented beautifully, and so it became the backbone of the Egyptian diet, baked, brewed, and blessed. Brewing began much the same way as baking. The 2 arts were twins, born of the same hearth. Women who did most of the household brewing would bake partially cooked barley bread, crumble it into large jars, mix it with water, and let it sit. They didn't yet know the science of yeast or fermentation. They just knew that after a few days, a rich, frothy liquid appeared on top. That foam was life itself. They called it zethum, and it would feed the nation. If you were to stand inside one of these early brewing houses, it wouldn't look so different from a bakery. Clay floors, straw baskets, and ovens glowing with faint red light. Jars lined against the walls, some sealed, some bubbling faintly. And that smell, sweet, earthy, slightly sour, filling the air like the breath of the gods. There was something almost magical about the process. It wasn't clean or measured. No scales, no thermometers, no timers. It was guided by intuition, by the look of the foam and the hum of the air. A good brewer could tell by scent alone when the beer was ready. Too short, and it would be weak and watery. Too long, and it turned bitter, sharp, almost medicinal. And so the art passed down, mother to daughter, brewer to apprentice, through gestures, not recipes. A handful of this, a touch of that, and above all, patience. Because beer, like people, couldn't be rushed. It's easy now to forget how revolutionary that was. Beer changed everything. It gave calories that could be stored and shared, it made unsafe water drinkable, and it turned gatherings into something sacred. There's an old saying from an Egyptian scribe, "Where there is no beer, there is no joy." And he wasn't exaggerating. When the workers built the pyramids at Giza, they were issued rations, not coins, not bread, but beer. 4 to 5 liters per day, sometimes more. Imagine that. Thousands of men hauling limestone under the blazing sun, surviving on a diet of onions, garlic, and a steady stream of beer. It wasn't luxury, it was necessity. Beer gave them strength, energy, and maybe just a little happiness in the midst of all that labor. The records say that on good days, the workers were even given extra beer. It was both a wage and a reward. And so the beer that began as a happy accident became the very foundation of Egypt's empire. But not all beer was created equal. The beer of the common people was thick and nourishing, closer to gruel than drink. It was drunk from small clay cups, sometimes strained through reeds to catch the solids. It filled the belly and dulled the day's fatigue. The elite, though, the priests, the nobles, the royal households, drank something finer. Their beer was filtered, spiced with honey, dates, and herbs. Sometimes it was perfumed with mandrake or lotus. Servants would pour it from polished jars, and musicians would play soft tunes as guests reclined on mats, sipping slowly. For them, beer wasn't survival. It was sophistication. But whether you were a worker in the sun or a noble in a shaded courtyard, you drank the same sacred essence. The barley's breath, the Nile's gift. It was something everyone shared. And that sharing bound Egypt together, like invisible threads running from hut to palace. Let's linger in that thought for a moment. In the early morning, before the sun has climbed above the horizon, the river still shrouded in mist, you can hear the faint rustle of reeds and the splash of water jars being filled. Someone hums a tune as they carry a basket of barley bread to the oven. Another stirs a pot of fermenting beer, checking its scent, tasting a drop with the tip of a reed. It's quiet work, rhythmic and sacred. They may not think of it that way. They're just doing what their mothers did and what their daughters will do. But in this repetition lies something almost eternal, because the Nile flooded, the barley grew, and people brewed, year after year, century after century. The Egyptians believed the gods themselves had taught humanity to make beer. It wasn't just sustenance, it was civilization in liquid form. Without it, the laborers would not have built, the priests would not have sung, and perhaps even the gods would not have been appeased. There's an inscription from the tomb of Ti, a noble from the Old Kingdom, showing servants brewing beer as an offering to the afterlife. The scene is oddly peaceful. Men pouring mash, women stirring jars, a priest watching serenely. And beside it, hieroglyphs that say, "Beer for the soul to refresh the heart for eternity." They believed that even in the afterlife the dead would thirst, and that beer was the drink of peace beyond the horizon. Sometimes I like to think about that, how something so simple, so ordinary, could be woven into the meaning of life itself. You can almost see a brewer, wiping the sweat from her brow, not realizing that her hands are part of something far greater. A culture built not just on stone and mathematics, but on the warmth of human ritual, of barley, water, and time. So when you imagine Egypt, try not to see only the pyramids and the gods, the gold and the grandeur. Picture the little things, the jars stacked in the corner, the sweet smell of yeast, the laughter that followed the first sip. That's where the real heart of Egypt lived. Because before there was empire, there was barley, and before there was order, there was beer. The sun has long slipped below the horizon, but Egypt is still awake. Not the solemn Egypt of temples and tombs, but a livelier one, pulsing with drums, laughter, and the clink of clay cups. The Nile glimmers nearby, catching shards of torchlight as the breeze carries the scent of roasted fish, figs, and freshly poured beer. Somewhere in the distance, a reed flute begins to play. Feasts were more than meals here. They were acts of gratitude, of devotion, of release. In a land where life depended entirely on the mercy of a river, every harvest, every flood, every birth or death was a reason to gather and to drink. And oh, how they drank. Let's step closer. A long table stretches beneath an awning woven from palm leaves. Its surface gleams with copper plates, heaped high with bread, stewed vegetables and skewered meats. Beside them, tall jars of beer stand ready, their rims sealed with clay. Servants move gracefully among the guests, cracking the seals, pouring golden-brown liquid into curved cups. The air is thick with music, hand drums rattling sistra, and the gentle pluck of a lute. Laughter spills between the rhythms, growing louder with each refill. Men lean close to one another, telling stories exaggerated by drink. Women cover their mouths as they laugh, bracelets jingling softly. There's a warmth in the air, not just from the torches, but from something ancient, familiar. That moment when a gathering crosses the invisible line from formality into joy, when a feast becomes a celebration, and a celebration becomes something sacred. In ancient Egypt, festivals were constant. Some were small, a family honoring their ancestors with food and beer. Others were massive, lasting days, where thousands would gather at temple courtyards. Beer flowed like water during these festivals. One inscription from the reign of Amenhotep III lists over 30,000 jars of beer brewed for a single celebration. Imagine that, the smell of grain and honey drifting for miles, the noise of people singing and clapping, the temple drums echoing into the desert night. There was no shame in joy. Drunkenness wasn't a sin, it was a state of communion. When the body grew loose and laughter came freely, they believed one was closer to the gods. To drink, to dance, to forget your name for a moment, that was not disgrace. It was divine surrender. Let's sit beside them for a while. You feel the clay cup in your hand, rough at the edges, warm from the liquid within. It smells faintly of bread, sweetened by dates. When you drink, it's thick and earthy, coating your tongue with barley and sun. Around you, the conversations flow like the river itself, unending, crossing and merging. To your right, a young farmer boasts about his new boat, swearing it can outrun the crocodiles. To your left, an old woman tells fortunes by watching how the beer froths. A child runs past laughing, holding a piece of flatbread like treasure. Somewhere, a cat stretches lazily beneath a table, half asleep in the warmth of the torches. And above it all, the sky, vast and silent, the stars glimmering over the endless river. Beer connected everyone that night. It was the bridge between the living and the divine, between labor and leisure. Even the gods, it was said, partook in feasts. At temples dedicated to Hathor, goddess of joy, the priestesses would dance with mirrors and tambourines. They wore floral garlands, their hair perfumed with oil, and as they swayed, the crowd followed. There are wall paintings that capture these scenes, women in white linen gowns, arms raised, faces serene with intoxication. They called it becoming Hathor. To lose oneself in dance and drink was to embody the goddess herself, the spirit of pleasure, fertility, and laughter. But joy had etiquette. The Egyptians valued balance in all things, the principle they called ma'at. Even in drinking, there was an unspoken rule. To lose control completely was unwise. A papyrus from the New Kingdom warns, "Take not too much beer, lest your words be foolish and your limbs fail you." And yet another text, found on the walls of a worker's house, says, "Drink and be merry, for tomorrow is uncertain." So it seems even then, Egypt debated what we still do now, the line between moderation and freedom. The feasts by the Nile were where those lines blurred beautifully. Farmers drank beside merchants, priests beside peasants, all equal under the moonlight. The barriers of class softened, if only for a few hours, in the warmth of drink and laughter. Food, too, played its part. Bowls of lentils, roasted duck, figs soaked in honey wine, and everywhere, bread. Flat loaves, thick loaves, round loaves, some baked with herbs, others sweet with dates. It was said that to host without bread and beer was to invite shame upon your name. They were the twin symbols of life, the body and the spirit together. If you could walk among the guests, you'd notice something else, the sound of gratitude. Toasts were made not just to one another, but to the gods. A guest might lift their cup and murmur softly, "To Hathor, who gives laughter." Another might whisper, "To Osiris, who blesses the harvest." Even the most casual sip carried the weight of tradition. There's something touching about that. Every act of joy, eating, drinking, singing, was also an act of worship. They didn't separate the sacred from the ordinary. They found holiness in the moment itself. By the time the night wears on, the drums slow. The flutes fade to silence. People recline against pillows, their laughter now soft and drowsy. Someone hums an old tune about the river's love for the moon. Someone else gently snores. And in that hazy, gentle calm, you realize this too is eternity. Because though the feasts ended, the laughter faded and the torches turned to ash, the feeling remained. That warm, fleeting moment when life felt full and kind. And maybe that's what they were really chasing. Not the drink itself, but the sense of connection that came with it. A reminder that the Nile would flood again, the fields would bloom, and joy, like beer, was meant to be shared. If you ever find yourself wandering through the back streets of an ancient Egyptian town, follow your nose. You'll smell it before you see it. That unmistakable scent of grain and yeast, thick in the air, earthy and alive. It drifts through alleys and courtyards, carried by the warm desert wind. Follow it, and you'll find a brewery. Not the kind of brewery we know today, with polished copper vats and tidy labels, but a place of clay, fire, and intuition. Here, beer is not manufactured. It's born. Step inside. The room is dim, the light filtered through reed mats. The floor is made of packed earth cool beneath your feet. Clay jars, some as tall as your waist, line the walls, each one sealed with mud or cloth. In the corner, a young woman stirs a thick mixture in a wide basin, her hands covered in pale froth. Nearby, another kneads bread made not for eating, but for brewing. Soft loaves of barley dough that will soon become liquid gold. The smell is dizzying, sweet, sour, warm. It clings to your skin, seeps into your clothes, and stays with you long after you've left. In ancient Egypt, the brewer was more than a craftsperson. They were a kind of alchemist, and often they were women. Across tomb paintings we see them, women crouched beside great vats, stirring mash with wooden paddles, pouring liquid through sieves woven from reeds. Their faces calm, focused, timeless. The hieroglyphs beside them speak of patience and care. She who brews well is loved by Hathor. These women didn't just feed their families, they nourished the gods themselves. Beer offerings were placed at tombs, temples, and festivals, and so the brewer, working in her humble courtyard, was in her own way keeping the world in balance. Let's watch her work. She begins with barley soaked in water until it softens and sprouts. Malt, though she wouldn't call it that. Then she dries it in the sun, crushes it gently with a stone pestle, and mixes it with fresh water from the Nile. Sometimes she adds dates or honey for sweetness, sometimes herbs for healing or spice. Then she tears up small pieces of partially baked barley bread and stirs them into the mix. Days pass. The mixture ferments quietly in the corner of her home, bubbles rising lazily to the surface. Each jar breathes in rhythm with the heat of the day, the cool of the night. And when she finally lifts the lid, a soft fizz escapes, the sound of barley turning into beer. No one taught her chemistry, but she knows somehow that life hides in these tiny bubbles, the invisible magic that transforms work into joy. In larger breweries, the ones attached to temples or estates, the process was the same but on a grander scale. Teams of workers moved in slow harmony, soaking, grinding, baking, fermenting. The air shimmered with dust and steam. The floor was slick with spilled mash. And everywhere the scent of barley and smoke. Supervisors, often priests or scribes, recorded the numbers. So many jars, so many loaves, so many days. Their reed pens scratched across wet clay, marking down the heartbeat of an empire sustained by beer. It was work, yes, hard, hot, endless, but it was sacred work. Every jar sealed, every cup poured, was part of the rhythm of Egypt itself. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine the brewery at noon. Outside, the sun blazes white across the mud brick roofs. Inside, the air hums with quiet life. A woman hums to herself as she stirs, her gold earrings glinting in the light. A child brings her water in a small bowl, and she smiles, wiping her brow. From the next room comes the sound of grinding, stone against stone, steady, hypnotic. You can almost hear time itself moving, slow and sure through the clatter and the hum. To brew beer in Egypt wasn't just to make a drink. It was to weave together grain, water, and patience, the three things that made civilization possible. The Egyptians saw fermentation as something holy, a sign of life's renewal. They didn't understand yeast, but they knew something alive was working in their jars, and they respected it. In temple rituals, beer was poured out as an offering to the gods, symbolizing creation, abundance, and resurrection. Osiris, the god of rebirth, was sometimes shown holding a stalk of barley. To drink beer was to take in the essence of life itself, the cycle of death and renewal that defined the Nile S-world. But the brewer also had her secrets. How long to soak the barley, how warm the room should be, when to stir, when to leave it still. These things couldn't be written down, they were felt, passed from one generation to the next through experience, smell, and sound. There's a certain pride in that, a quiet, knowing smile that comes from holding something ancient in your hands. The brewers of Egypt didn't seek fame. They sought perfection in the small things. The taste of a well-balanced beer, the satisfaction of a bubbling jar, the moment when the foam looked just right under the afternoon light. In some tomb paintings, you can see the brewers' tools laid out with near-religious precision: mortars, sieves, ladles, amphorae. They were buried with their masters, so that beer could be brewed in the afterlife. One scene shows a nobleman's servant handing him a cup of beer, the caption reading, "For his eternal refreshment." It's touching, isn't it? Even in death they imagined the comfort of that first sip after a long day. The temples themselves often had breweries attached. Priests oversaw their production, not just for the living, but for ritual. During certain ceremonies, beer was poured onto the ground as a libation, a way to feed the spirits, to connect heaven and earth. At the Festival of the Valley, when families visited the tombs of their ancestors, they brought bread and beer, setting them at the doorways with quiet prayers. It wasn't the act of drinking that mattered. It was the offering, the giving of what sustained life. So in these dusty halls of fermentation, hidden from the grand avenues and temple processions, Egypt's real pulse beat quietly. The brewer stirred, the jars bubbled, the river flowed, and every cup of beer, every drop offered to the gods or shared among friends, carried within it the memory of hands that worked unseen. When you think of Egypt, remember them. Not just the kings and their crowns, but the brewers and their barley, those who turned simple grain into the taste of eternity. The story of beer in Egypt isn't tea only about how it was made. It is about who drank it and what it meant to them. Because in a civilization so deeply bound by hierarchy, even intoxication had its place in the social order. Picture Egypt not as one uniform people, but as layers of humanity spread along the Nile. Priests in their white linen, scribes hunched over papyrus farmers bent beneath the sun, children splashing in irrigation canals, all connected by that winding ribbon of water. And in their cups, the same golden liquid, brewed from the same fields. It was one of the rare things that crossed boundaries, but not without distinction. Let's start at the bottom, with the workers and peasants. For them, beer was life itself. The laborers who quarried stone, plowed fields, or hauled mud brick from dawn to dusk didn't have much. Their pay came not in coins, but in kind, loaves of bread and jars of beer. The records from Deir el-Medina, a village of artisans who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings, show exactly how much. Each man received rations of around 4 liters of beer per day, sometimes more during festival seasons or intense labor. Women and children received smaller portions, but even they drank daily. And this wasn't the frothy, delicate beer of nobles. This was heavy stuff, thick, nourishing, and full of grain, almost like drinkable bread. It filled the stomach, replenished energy, and made the heat a little more bearable. Imagine a group of workers taking a break at midday. Their backs ache, their hands are raw, their skin glistens with sweat. One of them opens a jar, dips in a cup and passes it around. They drink, wipe their mouths and sigh with relief. For a few minutes, they are not laborers building monuments. They are men, alive and human, laughing in the sun. Move a little higher. The scribes, the craftsmen, the merchants. Their beer was lighter, filtered more carefully. They could afford a touch of sweetness, maybe dates or honey to smooth the flavor. They drank at social gatherings after trade negotiations, during weddings and funerals alike. Beer marked the rhythm of life, the beginning and the end, the joyful and the solemn. For these middle ranks, drinking wasn't just survival, it was social grace, a way to show generosity, to entertain, to be part of the flow of conversation. Even the act of pouring a cup for another was symbolic, a gesture of respect, of hospitality. And then, of course, came the elite, the noble families, the royal courtiers, the priests. Their beer was not brewed in the home, but in temple breweries, guarded by purity rituals and overseen by servants. They drank from polished vessels instead of clay cups. Their beer was filtered until clear, perfumed with herbs, sometimes even infused with fruit. In the courtyards of Thebes and Memphis, you could see the difference. Servants carried slender jars wrapped in linen, pouring carefully so that not a drop spilled. Guests reclined on mats beneath fans of ostrich feathers. Musicians plucked harps. Dancers swayed slowly in candlelight. And always, the beer flowed. It's easy to imagine these evenings as scenes of decadence, and perhaps they were. But to the Egyptians, even luxury had meaning. To drink was to participate in the blessings of the gods. The wealthy were expected to share that abundance, not hoard it. A nobleman's tomb inscription might boast not of riches, but of generosity. I gave bread to the hungry, beer to the thirsty, and clothes to the naked. Beer in this sense was a symbol of virtue, a way to prove you were a good person, kind and just. Even heaven, in their imagination, was described as a place of endless food and beer, where the righteous would never thirst again. And yet, amid all these ranks and rituals, beer was still deeply personal. Each person's relationship with it was different. For a farmer, it was fuel. For a priest, it was sacred. For a merchant, it was hospitality. For a mourner, it was comfort. That versatility made it the great equalizer. You could be rich or poor, tired or holy, but you knew what it meant to hold a cup, to take a sip, and to feel the same warmth rise in your chest. There's something deeply human about that, the shared intoxication, the small escape that connects every life, no matter how grand or humble. Still, there were rules. Priests, for example, had to remain pure before ceremonies, which meant avoiding beer for certain days or rituals. They saw intoxication as sacred when done for the gods, but careless drunkenness as disorder, a threat to Ma'at, the cosmic balance. So they drank carefully, often as part of ritual rather than recreation. But on festival nights, when the hymns to Hathor filled the air and the temples overflowed with offerings, the lines blurred. Even the priests were known to join in the revelry. There are reliefs showing them, smiling, cups in hand, faces slightly too relaxed for ceremony. You get the sense that even holiness allowed for a hangover now and then. For the common folk, beer wasn't about rules or restraint. It was woven into every stage of life. At births, mothers were given sweet beer mixed with honey to restore their strength. At weddings, families toasted with barley beer scented with lotus. At funerals, mourners left jars beside the dead, whispering, "May your thirst be quenched forever." Children too drank diluted beer, safer than river water and filled with nutrients. For them, it wasn't indulgence, it was nourishment. It's a strange thought, that the same liquid that built pyramids also soothed newborns and honored the dead. Beer was never just drink, it was life in liquid form, and perhaps that's why it endured. The jars changed shape, the recipes evolved, dynasties rose and fell, but the custom remained. Every person, from the lowest laborer to the mightiest pharaoh, understood the quiet pleasure of a shared drink. You can imagine them now set across centuries, each raising a cup to their lips. Different worlds, same motion. The farmer wiping the foam from his beard, the priest murmuring a prayer, the queen smiling faintly as she tastes honey-sweetened beer cooled by river water. All of them bound by that ancient human ritual. And as they drank, they lived the same truth we still know today, that sometimes joy comes not from grandness, but from something simple, a drink, a friend, a night beneath the stars. The ancient Egyptians didn't separate the sacred from the ordinary the way we often do. To them, the divine was everywhere, in the river, in the grain, in the warmth of sunlight on their skin. So when they brewed beer, they weren't just preparing a drink. They were reenacting a cosmic gift, a small act of creation repeated daily that tied their hands to the hands of the gods. Beer wasn't just for people. It was for the afterlife, for the spirits, for the unseen powers that shaped their world. It was poured into the earth as libation, carried to tombs as sustenance, and placed on temple altars as prayer. To offer beer was to say, "May you be refreshed, may you remember joy." Imagine a temple courtyard in the cool dawn. The air is heavy with incense and the faint sweetness of fermenting grain. Priests move slowly through the columns, their linen robes glowing gold in the early light. They chant softly, their voices blending with the steady murmur of the river just beyond the walls. On a low altar, rows of offerings wait, loaves of bread, bowls of figs, roasted ducks, and tall jars of beer, their surfaces still slick with morning dew. Each jar is a prayer, each drop a symbol of gratitude. The priests lift one, tilt it gently, and let the beer flow onto the ground. The liquid seeps into the earth, darkening the sand, disappearing into the soil like a whisper. Somewhere below, the spirits are said to drink, satisfied, honored, remembered. Beer had always been part of worship, but it held a special place among offerings. It was humble, yet essential. Bread and beer, the two pillars of existence. Together they formed what Egyptians called the divine meal. Every ritual, no matter how grand or small, began with them. You could offer gold or incense, but without bread and beer, the gods were hungry. Even the great temples at Karnak and Luxor listed beer among their daily tributes, measured not in jars but in thousands of jars. Scribes recorded them carefully. 100 jars to Amun-Ra, 40 to Hathor, 20 to Osiris. Every morning, fresh beer replaced the old, as though the gods themselves required their daily drink. To understand why, we need to think like the Egyptians did. Beer was transformation, a proof that life could change, renew, and thrive. Water turned to sustenance, grain turned to spirit, the ordinary turned divine. And so, beer became the perfect metaphor for creation itself. When the Nile flooded, it destroyed and renewed the land, just as fermentation destroyed grain but created life from it. That rhythm of loss and rebirth was sacred. To pour beer was to honor that eternal cycle. In temple hymns, they even compared beer to sunlight. "You shine like the golden beer of the morning, O Ra, who renews all things." Certain gods, of course, had a special relationship with intoxication. Foremost among them was Hathor, the lady of drunkenness, mistress of jubilation. She was the goddess of love, music, and joy, often depicted with a lotus crown and a gentle smile. In her honor, people drank not to forget, but to feel closer to her. The more they drank, the more they believed her spirit entered them, that laughter and music were forms of prayer. Her temple at Dendera still bears traces of that joy. On the walls are carvings of dancers and musicians, hands raised, faces lit with ecstasy. The inscriptions speak of beer offered to gladden the heart of Hathor. They called it divine intoxication, not shameful but holy. To become drunk under her gaze was to step briefly into her world, the world of love, laughter, and renewal. Another god tied to beer was Osiris, lord of resurrection. Beer offerings were left at his temples not for revelry, but remembrance. Osiris was said to have taught humanity agriculture itself, to make the seeds grow, the barley rise. So every harvest, brewers would pour out the first jar to him, murmuring blessings for abundance. It is strange to think that the same beer that built the pyramids also served as a bridge between life and death. At funerals, mourners poured beer over the tomb as a final farewell. The dead were buried with jars beside them for the long journey beyond. To arrive in the afterlife without beer would have been unthinkable, like entering eternity thirsty. And then there was Sekhmet, fierce, lion-headed, radiant with rage. She was the goddess of war, of plague, of destruction. but also of protection and healing. Her story, perhaps more than any other, shows how beer became a divine instrument of mercy. According to the old myth, Sekhmet once set out to destroy humanity for its disobedience. Her wrath was endless. She slaughtered by day, drank blood by night, until the gods themselves feared she would wipe out the world. So Ra devised a plan. He commanded that beer be dyed red with ochre and poured across the fields, a lake of crimson. When Sekhmet came upon it thinking it blood, she drank deeply and drank again and again. She grew dizzy, laughing, staggering, and at last fell asleep. When she woke, her rage was gone. She looked upon what she had done and wept, and thus humankind was spared, saved by intoxication. Every year thereafter, the Egyptians celebrated her mercy with the festival of drunkenness. Tens of thousands gathered at her temples to drink, sing, and dance until dawn. It was said that those who stayed awake all night in joy would receive her protection for the year ahead. To drink was to honor the moment when wrath turned to compassion, when chaos became laughter. You can almost see it now, the moonlight over Dendera, the flicker of torches, the sound of drums echoing through the pillars. Men and women dancing with lotus garlands in their hair, cups raised, voices calling out to the goddess, laughter spilling into the night, tears mixing with joy. And beneath it all, that quiet, sacred truth, that sometimes even the gods needed to let go. To the Egyptians, drunkenness wasn't rebellion. It was remembrance, a reminder that the gods too were emotional, imperfect, alive. That joy was as holy as sorrow. That laughter could heal what reason could not. And maybe that's why thousands of years later, the spirit of that belief still lingers. Every toast, every shared drink, carries a little echo of that ancient offering, a promise of connection, of celebration, of gratitude. Beer wasn't simply consumed in Egypt, it was worshipped, poured, sung to, and remembered. And through it, the people of the Nile learned one of life's simplest truths, that pleasure, when offered with reverence, can be a form of prayer. Imagine Egypt on the eve of the great festival, the air trembling with excitement, the temples of Sekhmet glowing under the red light of torches. It's late summer, when the Nile has swollen and begun to recede, leaving behind the promise of new life. Across the land, people prepare for one of the most unusual celebrations in the ancient world, a festival devoted not to war, not to work, not even to harvest, but to drinking. The festival of drunkenness, Tek they called it, was not an act of indulgence but of remembrance. It honored the day the goddess Sekhmet's rage was soothed by beer dyed red to look like blood, the day humanity was spared from annihilation. And so, once a year, Egyptians reenacted that divine intoxication, not out of mockery or excess, but gratitude. This was no quiet ritual. It was a storm of sound and color, of laughter and song. And as the first stars appeared above the desert, you could feel it begin. Picture the temple of Mut at Karnak, one of the most sacred places dedicated to Sekhmet. By nightfall, the courtyards are already crowded. Priests walk solemnly, carrying torches that make the polished columns flicker like rivers of flame. Musicians tune their lutes, their fingers trembling with anticipation. And everywhere, the smell of roasted meat, honey, and warm beer fills the air. People wear garlands of lotus flowers, their hair oiled and shining. The men have painted their eyes with kohl. The women wear perfume made from myrrh and cinnamon. Even the poorest families have saved something special for tonight, a jug of freshly brewed beer perhaps, or a bundle of dates. The drums start softly at first, a slow, steady heartbeat. Then faster, wilder. Voices rise in song. The festival of drunkenness has begun. In the heart of the temple, priests pour the first libations, beer dyed a deep, rusty red, poured into basins shaped like lotus petals. They whisper the old words, "May she be calmed, may her heart be sweetened, may the world be renewed." Then, as if on cue, the people outside begin to drink. It's not a toast or a small sip. It's a wave, thousands raising cups, tilting their heads back, and letting the sacred brew spill down their throats. The sound of it, laughter, coughing, cheering, rolls through the air like thunder. Soon the music grows louder, more rhythmic. Dancers step into the courtyards, their movements sinuous, hypnotic. Sistra, the bronze rattles of Hathor, shake in time with the drums. The crowd claps, chants, and sways. And as the night deepens, the boundaries between celebration and worship blur completely. People are laughing, singing, falling into one another's arms. Some begin to weep, others close their eyes and whisper prayers through their smiles. To outsiders, it might look like chaos. To the Egyptians, it was order of another kind, ma'at expressed through release. The festival of drunkenness wasn't just about indulgence. It was a ritual of transformation, a controlled descent into madness followed by rebirth. The Egyptians believed that in losing oneself to drink and music, one could touch the divine, cross the fragile border between human and God. It was the one night when ordinary rules dissolved, when even the most pious priest could loosen his robe, dance, and laugh under the same sky as the farmers and servants. At dawn, the intoxication gave way to renewal. The festival ended not with hangovers or shame, but with gratitude. As the sun rose, the priests led the people in prayer, thanking Sekhmet for mercy, for restraint, for allowing destruction to turn to laughter once more. The red beer was gone, poured into the sand, absorbed by the earth like a promise kept. There's something deeply human in that image, an entire civilization finding peace through ritual joy. They didn't drink to forget their troubles, but to remember their place in the fragile dance of existence, to remind themselves that life could be fierce but also forgiving, that anger like Sekhmet's could be soothed, not by force, but by compassion, by laughter, by the soft dizziness of letting go. Let's linger in that temple for a moment as the night reaches its peak. The stars overhead shimmer like scattered embers. The torches flicker in the wind, throwing long shadows across the sandstone walls. A woman sways to the rhythm of the drums, her lotus garland slipping down her shoulder. A priest nearby, his cup half empty, watches her with a dazed smile, half amused, half reverent. Someone begins to sing an old hymn, the melody slow and mournful. Let the heart of Sekhmet be sweet and her wrath turned to peace. The crowd joins in, their voices blending into a single sound, rising and falling with the desert wind. It's haunting, beautiful, and just a little sad. Because beneath all the joy lies the memory of fear, of what might have been if the goddess had not been calmed. Then someone laughs loudly, joyfully, and the sadness vanishes. The drums resume, faster now, insistent, alive. The festival continues. By the time dawn breaks, the temple courtyards are littered with wilted flowers and empty jars. The air smells of yeast, incense, and morning dew. People lie sleeping on mats, heads resting on each other's shoulders. The priests, weary but smiling, move quietly among them, sprinkling cool water from the Nile onto their foreheads, a symbolic cleansing. The water glitters in the sunrise, catching in their hair like drops of gold. Sekhmet, they say, is calm again. The world has been saved once more. The festival of drunkenness tells us something profound about the Egyptians. They knew that chaos was always near, in flood, famine, or war, and that it could never be entirely banished. But instead of fearing it, they gave it a place in their calendar, a night of ritual release, a controlled moment of madness to keep the rest of the year sane. In that way, the festival wasn't a contradiction to their order, it was part of it. It was a reminder that joy and destruction were twins, that laughter could keep wrath at bay, and that sometimes the most sacred act is simply to live fully, to dance, to drink, to love, and to trust that morning will come again. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel it. The pulse of the drums fading, the scent of lotus and beer in the air, the soft hum of voices drifting toward sleep. For one night, everyone, peasant and priest, soldier and scribe, became one. Drunk not just on beer, but on existence itself. And as the sun rose over the temples, the Nile gleaming like liquid gold, you could almost believe that the gods too were smiling. There's a tender truth about the Egyptians. For all their gods and grandeur, they were deeply, recognizably human. Behind the rituals and ceremonies, they laughed, flirted, quarreled, and made the same mistakes we do. And nowhere was that humanity clearer than in their relationship with drink. Beer was part of their lives, as natural as breathing, as steady as the river. But like all things powerful, it carried two faces, joy and foolishness. The Egyptians embraced both, often with a smile. They sang songs about love kindled over shared cups, about courage found in the bottom of a jar, and about regrets that came with the morning sun. In their drinking you can hear their hearts, bright, flawed, and endlessly alive. Picture an ordinary evening by the Nile. The fields are quiet, the water silver beneath the moon. A small family gathers outside their home, clay walls cool to the touch, a lantern flickering softly in the breeze. They share bread, figs, and a jar of beer. The children chase each other in the dust. The elders talk of harvests and dreams. Nearby, two young lovers sit apart from the others, whispering. She laughs, softly, nervously, as he pours her a small cup. They drink, their eyes catching in the firelight. It's awkward, sweet, eternal. Somewhere behind them, someone teases them, and the laughter spreads like warm wind. This, too, was Egypt, not just temples and tombs, but moments like this. The kind you can almost still feel. Beer for them was social glue. It loosened tongues, softened pride, and made storytelling easier. In taverns, small noisy spaces tucked behind markets, people met to share gossip, argue politics, or simply escape the weight of the day. A few cups in, and a fisherman might boast about the crocodile he nearly caught, or a scribe might swear that he once corrected the pharaoh himself. No one believed them, but everyone laughed anyway. And laughter, as much as beer, was what people came for. The Egyptians loved to laugh. There are drawings of men doubled over with mirth, women clapping their hands, cats stealing food from tables as guests roar with joy. It wasn't a culture of restraint. It was a culture of living fully, of embracing the moment while it was still warm. But with joy came foolishness, and they knew that too. In the tombs of scribes, we find admonitions carved in elegant hieroglyphs, like a father's patient advice to his son. Do not drink too much beer, lest you speak foolishly, and your words shame you. There's another that reads, he who drinks his fill forgets his brother, neglects his work, and falls as though struck by a god. They had seen enough mornings after to know how fragile balance could be. And yet even in those warnings there's no scorn, only understanding. The tone is gentle, like an old friend reminding you not to overdo it. Because everyone, even the priests, had been there once. The heavy head, the quiet regret, the vow of never again. Let's slip inside one of those taverns for a closer look. It's small, half open to the street, its floor swept but dusty. A few wooden stools, low tables, a shelf with jars of beer sealed in wax. The air hums with conversation. A man sits at the corner, slumped and smiling, his eyes glassy but kind. A woman beside him refills his cup, shaking her head in mock disapproval. He raises it high, mumbling, "To Hathor." She rolls her eyes but drinks too, because why not? In the corner, two older men argue about taxes. At another table, someone plays a small harp. A stray dog dozes underfoot, tail twitching. And above it all the smell, yeast, smoke, and laughter, mingling into something comfortingly human. You can almost hear it, can't you? The rhythm of voices, the rise and fall of joy. The world's first version of a neighborhood bar. And yet, when the night faded and silence crept in, so did something softer, reflection. Because for all their merriment, the Egyptians were not blind to consequence. They knew that pleasure could tip into sorrow, that excess could bruise the spirit. Some of their love poems, found on scraps of papyrus, are whispered confessions wrapped in beauty. I drank with you, my heart grew foolish. I said too much and yet not enough. Others are playful warnings. Do not trust a man with beer in his hand. He remembers nothing but promises everything. How familiar that sounds. Thousands of years later, the same truths, the same sighs. Still, they didn't moralize. They understood that life was meant to be lived in balance, between joy and responsibility, laughter and restraint. To them, the danger wasn't in drinking, but in forgetting what it symbolized. Beer wasn't meant to drown life out, but to celebrate it. That's why in festivals and family gatherings, every sip was preceded by a toast to the gods, to Hathor, to Osiris, to the sun and the river. They believed that if you drank with gratitude, the gods would bless your heart with joy rather than regret. It wasn't superstition, it was mindfulness in ancient form. Somewhere in Thebes, perhaps, a scribe lies half awake, nursing the dull ache of the morning after. He opens his eyes, squints at the sunlight spilling across the wall, and mutters to himself, "No beer tonight." But he knows, deep down, he'll break that vow. When the next festival comes or the next friend knocks on his door, he'll pour another jar, laugh again, and forget the ache. Because life, he knows, is too brief for long regrets. Even the pharaohs in their grandeur weren't immune to the pleasures of beer. Banquet scenes carved in their tombs show cups raised, musicians playing, servants pouring endlessly. You can almost see the satisfaction on their faces, part divine ruler, part weary human, savoring a moment of comfort after the weight of ruling. Perhaps even they understood that kingship too was easier with a little warmth in the blood. Beer in Egypt was the language of connection between gods and mortals, between lovers, between friends. It carried laughter, eased sorrow, mended quarrels, and celebrated beginnings. It taught them, in its quiet way, that joy was sacred but fleeting, to be cherished, not hoarded. And so they drank, not to escape life, but to meet it halfway, to taste it, to laugh at it, to forgive it. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them, the murmur of voices by the Nile, the clink of clay cups, the sigh of someone saying, "Just one more." And in that sound lies the whole story of humanity, messy, tender, full of love and laughter, and just enough regret to make it real. The sun rises mercilessly over Egypt. The golden light that seemed so gentle the night before now burns with quiet vengeance. Somewhere near the edge of a village, a man stirs in his sleep. His mouth is dry, his head heavy, his memories patchy. The sounds of the morning, donkeys braying, birds calling, a distant splash from the river, feel far too loud. He groans, sits up slowly and mutters a prayer to Hathor. Though whether it's of thanks or complaint, even he isn't sure. Yes, even in the land of gods and geometry, of eternal stone and sacred order, people woke up with hangovers. And just like us, they swore they'd never drink that much again. For all their spiritual wisdom, the Egyptians were practical people. They understood the body as much as the soul, and they kept records of how to cure nearly every ailment, from broken bones to broken pride. On papyri filled with neat looping hieroglyphs, we find recipes for what we might now call the morning after. One such remedy appears in the Ebers Papyrus, one of the oldest medical texts in history. It suggests a curious mix: ground coriander, celery, and the inner bark of the willow tree, steeped in water and drunk slowly. The physician who wrote it claims it soothes the head and cools the heart. Perhaps it did, or perhaps it just gave the sufferer something bitter enough to distract from the pain. Another text recommends chewing a mix of prickly pear and incense resin, a remedy that sounds poetic, but was likely unpleasant. Still, it shows something timeless. Even 5,000 years ago, humans were looking for ways to undo a good time. Hangovers weren't only physical, they were moral too. A few lines from a scribe's manual, written for young apprentices, warns gently, "A night of drunkenness brings a day of sorrow. The mouth speaks folly, and the body remembers." You can almost hear an elder shaking his head as he writes, amused but resigned. Because he knows that advice rarely stops youth, it only makes the next mistake wiser. But Egypt was not a land of guilt. Even their regrets were measured, graceful, almost affectionate. They didn't condemn pleasure, they simply tried to balance it. Their concept of mahat, harmony, order, truth, applied not just to the stars and temples, but to everyday life. Too much laughter could be as unbalanced as too much sorrow. Too much beer as unsteady as too much toil. Harmony always. Still, the mornings after a festival must have been something to behold. Imagine Thebes or Memphis after the festival of Sekhmet. Thousands sprawled across courtyards, temple steps, and riverbanks, sleeping off divine intoxication. Priests walking quietly through the aftermath, sprinkling cool Nile water on the faces of those still dreaming. Vendors setting up early stalls of bread and lentils, knowing full well they'd sell out before noon. Someone sits at the river's edge, staring at his reflection in the water. He dips his hands in, splashes his face, and watches the ripples distort his tired expression. He remembers flashes of the night, the drums, the laughter, the priestess's song. It feels both near and distant, like something sacred and embarrassing at once. He smiles to himself despite the headache. It was worth it. The Egyptians were fond of balance, but they were also fond of forgiveness. Theirs was a culture that accepted imperfection as part of being alive. If you drank too much, you simply made an offering the next morning. A small loaf, a bowl of beer, a whispered apology to Hathor or Sekhmet. Then you went back to work. The Nile didn't stop flowing for your mistakes, and neither did life. There's a certain comfort in that simplicity. No drama, no guilt, just acknowledgement, gratitude, and motion. You fell, you stood again. You lived, you learned. Or at least, you told yourself you did. Let's step into a small kitchen after a long night. The smell of yeast and smoke lingers faintly in the air. A woman kneels beside an oven, heating bread. Her husband sits nearby, head in his hands, eyes half shut. On the table before him, a clay cup filled with something greenish and strong, the morning's cure. "Drink," she says without sympathy. He obeys, grimacing. She smiles, shaking her head. "You always say, 'Just one more,'" she murmurs. He grunts in reply, too tired to defend himself. A moment later, their child runs in, laughing, chasing a cat. The man looks up and can't help but smile. The headache fades just a little. Outside, the Nile sparkles like a ribbon of silver. The fields glisten with dew. Life goes on, gently, endlessly. It's easy to forget that ancient people had mornings like ours, weary, slow, hazy. They may have built pyramids and carved hieroglyphs, but they also woke up late, looked for bread, and swore off beer until the next feast. The wisdom of Egypt wasn't in avoiding mistakes, but in embracing the rhythm of them, the rise, the fall, the laughter in between. They believed that even the gods understood that rhythm. Hathor herself, after all, was the goddess of joy and of restoration. Her temples were not only places of music and dancing, but also of healing. To offer her beer was to ask for mercy, not just from the gods, but from one's own foolishness. There's a small poem scratched clumsily into a shard of pottery found near Abydos. It reads, "Last night I drank with my friends. Today the sun mocks me, but the beer was sweet and my heart was light, so I shall not curse it." No philosopher could have said it better. They understood that the price of joy was sometimes a heavy head, but that joy was worth the price. The next time the festivals came or the workday ended with laughter, they would fill their jars again. The promise of balance would return. Maybe this time they'd stop sooner, maybe not. Either way, the sun would rise and the Nile would flow. There's something eternal in that cycle. Indulgence, regret, renewal, repeated through millennia. Because what is civilization, if not the art of making mistakes beautifully? If you close your eyes, you can almost hear it. The groan of someone waking late, the splash of river water, the soft laughter of forgiveness. A hangover by the Nile, 5,000 years ago, proof that even in the age of pyramids, humanity was still gloriously human. For all their love of joy and celebration, the ancient Egyptians also knew when to stop. They lived in a world of dualities, sun and shadow, birth and death, feast and fast. And while beer was the drink of daily life, it had no place inside the sacred silence of certain spaces. In the temples where the gods were believed to dwell, sobriety was not a virtue, it was a law. Inside those vast stone walls the air was different, cool still, perfumed with incense and purpose. The noise of the world, the markets, the laughter, the drums, faded to nothing. Only whispers, footsteps, and the distant rustle of linen. It was a world apart, a sanctuary of discipline. Here the priests lived by strict rules. Their lives were a rhythm of purity and restraint. They shaved their bodies daily, bathed multiple times, and followed diets designed to cleanse the spirit as much as the flesh. Beer, in this context, was both revered and forbidden. It could be offered to the gods, but not tasted by the priest. Imagine a dawn inside the temple of Amun at Karnak. The first light spills over the columns, painting the hieroglyphs gold. A group of priests walk in procession, their feet bare against the cool stone. They carry vessels of milk, honey, bread, and jars of beer, sealed tight, their aroma faint but unmistakable. The beer is set before the god's statue, not to be consumed, but to feed the divine essence of the world. One priest, his hands trembling slightly, pours a thin stream onto the ground, whispering a prayer. He is not tempted. He is in awe. The beer is no longer drink. It is offering, transformation, language between realms. When the ritual ends, the beer will be removed, sometimes shared among the temple staff, sometimes poured into the earth. Either way, the priests remain unswayed. Their role is to serve, not to taste. The temple was, in many ways, the opposite of the tavern. Where one was filled with noise, the other thrived on silence. Where one brought chaos, the other restored order. The Egyptians believed that the two must coexist, that joy without restraint became madness, but restraint without joy became lifeless. And so, each had its place. The priestess purity and the peasantess laughter were both essential parts of Ma'at, the cosmic balance that kept the world whole. Even the gods themselves reflected this duality. Hathor, goddess of drunken joy, and Thoth, god of reason and writing, were both worshipped in equal measure. Too much of either, and the universe would wobble out of harmony. The priests themselves were not scornful of beer, far from it. They understood its holiness perhaps better than anyone. They simply recognized that within the temple it belonged to the gods, not to them. The rules were clear. A priest who entered the sanctuary after drinking risked divine punishment. Texts carved on temple walls warned sternly, "He who drinks beer before serving shall defile his tongue and his soul. The god will turn his face from him." It wasn't fear that kept them sober. It was reverence. They believed the human body, when intoxicated, could no longer carry divine truth. To serve the gods required a still mind, calm, sharp, and clear, like the surface of the Nile before dawn. And yet even these strict servants of the gods had their humanity. There are hints, in letters, in jokes scrawled on ostraca, that priests, too, sometimes slipped. One shard from Thebes bears a playful note written by a young initiate. "The overseer forbade us beer last night. I obeyed until I smelled the brew. May Hathor forgive me." You can almost see the sheepish grin behind those words. The tension between discipline and temptation was as old as Egypt itself. But rather than punish, the culture forgave. There was an understanding that even the purest hearts sometimes stumbled. The key was not perfection, it was return. To fall, to atone, to try again. In larger temples, entire storage rooms were dedicated to beer. Not for personal use, but for the rituals. Vast cellars of clay jars labeled with careful precision. Some were for daily offerings, others for festivals, others still for funerals or royal ceremonies. Each batch brewed under sacred supervision, each ingredient measured and blessed. The process itself was ritual. Water drawn at dawn from the Nile, barley ground at noon, the mash stirred by temple women singing hymns to Hathor. The final product was poured into decorated amphorae, sealed with reed and wax, and marked with the date of brewing. The scribe would record it all on a tablet. 20 jars for the temple of Amun, offered in the name of the pharaoh, may he live forever. The beer might never be drunk, but its making was an act of devotion. Every jar symbolized the people's gratitude, their trust that the gods would continue to flood the river, ripen the barley, and bless their homes. Let's pause here and listen. In the cool darkness of the temple, time slows. You can hear the soft drip of water, the distant chant of priests echoing through stone corridors. A small beam of sunlight slips through a narrow crack, dust swirling in its glow. A jar of beer sits beside a statue, its surface gleaming faintly in the light. No one touches it. It belongs to something greater. For the Egyptians, this stillness was sacred. Drunkenness was life's celebration, but sobriety was its reflection. The two together made existence whole. Outside, beyond the temple walls, laughter still echoes. The markets are alive, the taverns busy, the air full of humanity's beautiful noise. And perhaps that's why the priests never condemned drink. They understood that the same beer which filled the jars inside their sanctuaries also filled the cups of workers outside. The divine and the mundane were two halves of the same truth. The gods didn't live apart from people. They lived through them. And so when the evening came and the temple gates closed, even the holiest priests might look up at the stars, smile, and whisper a small toast in their hearts. Not with beer, but with gratitude. because to be human, even in service to eternity, was itself a kind of prayer. If you've ever sat with friends, a drink in hand, laughter spilling into the night, you've already touched something ancient. That simple, human ritual, raising a glass, sharing a story, letting the world slow down for a while, began long before cities had names, long before we wrote anything down. And nowhere did it live more vividly than along the Nile. The Egyptians didn't just invent beer as a beverage. They invented what it meant to gather, to connect, to be human together. 5,000 years have passed, yet the echo of those clay cups still rings faintly in every pub, cafe, and kitchen table today. Let's trace that echo. In the ruins of old settlements like Hierakonpolis and Abydos, archaeologists have found the remains of massive breweries, industrial by ancient standards. Clay vats, large enough to hold hundreds of liters, blackened by fire, lined up like soldiers in the dust. Chemical traces inside them still carry the faint fingerprint of fermentation. Barley sugars, yeast residues, hints of dates and honey. These were not makeshift operations. They were organized, efficient, almost modern. Some may have brewed thousands of jars a week, supplying temples, work crews, and entire towns. It's humbling to think that the world's first large-scale production lines were not tea for weapons or tool, but for beer, a civilization sustained by comfort as much as conquest. But Egypt's influence didn't stay within its borders. Beer, that warm and faithful companion, began its slow journey through the world. From the banks of the Nile, it traveled north to the Levant, then east to Mesopotamia, and later westward toward Greece and Rome. Each culture changed it, claimed it, made it their own. The Sumerians flavored it with dates and coriander. The Babylonians regulated its sale by law. The Greeks called it zethos, borrowing Egypt's own word, though they preferred wine. And yet, even as empires rose and fell, the Egyptian idea endured. That drink could be both nourishment and celebration, both sacred and ordinary. The Greeks may have turned to philosophy, the Romans to politics, but the Egyptians had already mastered something simpler, the art of living well. When we look at the art on tomb walls, we see this philosophy preserved in color and rhythm. Workers hauling grain, women kneading dough, brewers stirring great jars, dancers clapping their hands, all side by side. Life and joy, work and rest, spirit and body, everything in harmony. It wasn't an ideal, it was a truth. Even the Book of the Dead, that most solemn of texts, mentions beer. The deceased prays, "May I have bread and beer, which are the gifts of the gods, every day without end." I imagine that, in a world that dreamed of eternity, the ultimate comfort was not jewels or palaces, but a loaf and a cup. Centuries later, long after the temples fell silent, travelers still wrote of Egypt's brews. Greek historians like Herodotus described the locals drinking a fermented drink made from barley. He seemed amused, maybe even skeptical, but he noted their happiness, their vitality. To him it was strange, to them it was life. Even in the Coptic Christian period, long after the gods of Hathor and Osiris had faded, beer endured. Monks brewed it in their monasteries, farmers in their courtyards, widows in small clay pots by the river. The recipes changed, the prayers changed, but the act of the stirring, the fermenting, the sharing remained. And then, somehow across time, that same impulse spread to every corner of the earth. From medieval alehouses in England to rice brewers in Japan, from Bavarian monasteries to Ethiopian farms, all repeating the same sacred pattern of grain, water, and patience. A ritual older than writing, older than religion itself. Even now we drink in the same ways they did, to celebrate, to mourn, to remember, to forget. We toast to love, to loss, to hope, to health. Different words, same heartbeat. The Egyptians would recognize it instantly. Let's imagine for a moment a kind of time fold, the boundary between centuries thinning. You sit at a wooden table in the soft light of evening, your friends around you. Someone pours a drink, not from a clay jar this time, but from glass. You raise it, smiling. The gesture feels effortless, automatic. And yet, beneath it, ancient hands mirror yours. The brewer in her courtyard, the worker by the river, the priest offering a libation. The same motion, the same warmth, an unbroken chain of joy across 5 millennia. The Egyptians didn't think of their beer as invention. They thought of it as discovery, something the gods had hidden in the barley for humanity to find. And maybe that's still true. Maybe it isn't the drink itself that matters, but what it awakens, the laughter, the stories, the connection, that quiet reminder that life, in all its simplicity, is still worth celebrating. The next time you raise a glass, as beer, wine, or water, think of them. Think of the brewers bent over their vats, the laborers at dusk sharing a jar, the priests pouring libations beneath the temple stars. Their lives long gone, but their gestures still alive in ours. The Nile no longer floods as it once did, and the gods of Egypt no longer receive their daily offerings. But the spirit of their joy, that humble, golden, human joy, still flows quietly in every toast. So here's to them, to the brewers, the workers, the dreamers, the ones who turned barley and water into civilization itself. To the first laughter ever carried on a sip of beer, to the ancient heartbeat that still hums beneath our own. Raise your glass, wherever you are. The story hasn't ended. It never really does. Night falls over Egypt once more. The river gleams like a ribbon of bronze winding its eternal path toward the sea. The day's heat softens into the hush of evening, and the world slows, as it always has. Somewhere near the edge of the water, a small fire flickers. A family gathers close. They've worked hard under the sun, and now the jars are open again, filled not with abundance, but enough. Bread, beer, laughter, the same ancient trinity that sustained a civilization. Children drift to sleep beside the embers, their faces glowing in the firelight. Elders speak softly, remembering old seasons, old floods, old loves. The sound of the river merges with their voices, until it's impossible to tell which came first, the water or the stories. Egypt lived and breathed through that rhythm. Work and rest, restraint and release, life and afterlife. Even in their monuments, so solid, so certain, there was always a whisper of impermanence. The pyramids may have reached for eternity, but it was in these small, fragile moments that the Egyptians found it. A sip shared between friends, a song rising over the fields, a cup raised to the gods beneath a sky that never forgot them. Look up with them for a moment. The stars shimmer against the deep velvet of the desert night. Each one feels close enough to touch. The Egyptians believed those stars were the spirits of the blessed dead, shining forever over the land they once walked. And perhaps if you listen closely, you can almost hear their laughter echoing faintly between the constellations. They are not solemn or distant. They are joyful, eternal, but still human in their joy. It is strange how something as simple as beer can tell the story of a people, their hopes, their fears, their understanding of what it meant to be alive. From the grand temples of Thebes to the smallest village hut, that same drink linked them all. It bridged class, faith, and time. It gave nourishment, courage, and a reason to sing. The Egyptians didn't need philosophy to understand life's fleeting beauty. They felt it in every swallow, every shared moment under the open sky. They believed joy was divine, not because it lasted, but because it passed. A gift to be savored before it faded. And that, perhaps, is the greatest wisdom they left us. Let's return, one last time, to that quiet courtyard. The fire burns low. A man tilts his cup, finds it empty, and smiles. He doesn't refill it. He leans back, closes his eyes, and listens to the hum of insects, to the slow whisper of the Nile. In that sound, he hears everything. The laughter of festivals, the chants of priests, the songs of harvest, the soft scolding of his wife, the giggle of his child. All the small pieces that made life worth living. He sighs, content. Tomorrow, he'll rise with the sun, tend the fields, give thanks. But for now he sits quietly, letting the world breathe through him. Thousands of years later, his world has changed. The gods are silent, the temples worn down by sand and time. But the feeling, that moment of calm, of gratitude, of simple fullness, still lingers, passed down in our own small rituals. A shared meal, a soft laugh, a glass lifted gently in the glow of twilight. The Egyptians would understand, because they too knew what it meant to pause, to find the sacred in the ordinary, to hold something simple and see the universe reflected within it. If you ever find yourself by water on a quiet night, think of them. Think of the brewers with their clay jars, the farmers resting by the fields, the dancers in the torchlight, the priests in the cool dawn. Their world may be gone, but its heartbeat is still there, slow, warm, eternal. You can almost hear it in the rustle of reeds, in the soft lap of water against the shore. The same song that lulled Egypt to sleep for thousands of years, the song of life itself. And as the last stars shimmer above the desert, you take one final breath and feel it, that gentle hum of connection stretching across millennia. A people who loved, who laughed, who lived fully, and who, perhaps more wisely than we do, knew that joy and gratitude were the closest things to immortality. So here's to them, to the Nile, to the barley, to the endless rhythm of life, and to us, still raising our cups in their memory. If you enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, maybe leave a like, or just let the story carry you to sleep. Good night, and may the Nile always rise in your dreams.